Welcome to episode 336 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me today, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bell. How are you, sir?
I'm awesome. How are you?
Good. Boy, it just seems like just last week we just did 335. I have.
It's weird how that happens.
But you survived the holidays?
That was way back in 2025. And here we are in 2026.
And your holidays and New Year's and everything, you survived.
I did. And you?
Yeah. All my fingers and toes still attached. So
the best way to get through the holidays.
Yeah. I will admit I'm getting to a point where we didn't go out to do anything for New Year's, which you traditionally do, and I didn't hate it. So I guess that's another sign of getting old.
Welcome to old age.
But anyway.
Welcome to old age. On this episode, we have some wonderful stories for today. Some of these I thought were actually quite interesting. There's one about some recommended controls based on cyber insurance companies' input. There's actually a real live victim, because typically you don't see like the outcome of some of these high profile vulnerabilities or hacks. So we actually have one related to Shai Hulud. Wired magazine got popped and apparently isn't really talking about it. There was a super interesting court decision here in the US, won't really make a difference anywhere else, related to software liability. I thought that was worth talking about. And then sometimes the doers at Home Depot don't get it done. And so we'll close on that one, which I'm going to jump ahead just to a reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express are ours and not those of our employers.
That's true.
And,
Past,
and
future, present.
Very heartfelt thank you to our Patreon sponsors. And if you do want to become a sponsor, you will get access to our episodes a week before everybody else. And you can do so on our Patreon site. It's patreon.com/defensivesec. So thank you very much. It does help defray the cost of running the show. So thank you again.
Absolutely. You guys are awesome. It is very humbling that people out there just donate money to support our cause. And we really, really do appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right. First up, we have some controls that cyber insurers like. And I do not know what happened to the image there. Shit. Well,
we'll do it live.
Yes, this one comes from Dark Reading, and the title here is New Tech Deployments That Cyber Insurers Recommend for 2026. So there were a couple of interesting stats in the lead up to their actual recommended controls. One was that in the first half of 2025, cyber insurance claims from vendor outages were way down. They dropped by half, while damages associated with phishing attacks went up by about 30%. So that's a very interesting dynamic. This is something that we've seen, over the course of running this show. The attacks don't stop. How it happens kind of sloshes around from one technique to another. And so this is another example how, in the past, we've seen many of the attacks happening against end users, and then we saw it shift over to more infrastructure and then supply chain, and now apparently, at least as it pertains to those that are causing companies to file claims, it's back to phishing attacks.
Yeah, it is interesting how it's somewhat, I don't want to say it's cyclical. I don't know that phishing attacks are ever going to go away entirely from their list. It's so super effective and highly impactful. And often phishing is, as we've seen in other reports and other summaries of attacks, it's usually some aspect of, I think we've seen up to 80 attacks have some sort of social engineering of some variety. And the thing that's a little tough when you get these summaries like this is there's a lot of nuance. There's also a lot of different types of particular attack techniques that get lumped together under social engineering or phishing or whatever. So, which helps, right? It helps us when we're trying to understand what are the big themes and what are the big considerations. But there's usually a lot of nuance lost when you start lumping these together into these big, broad categories, I think.
Good point. It's a really good point. But I think it kind of directionally points you in the area where you should be focusing. So for example, I think, as we've talked about in the past, we've done probably a lot of what is in the realm of possible in terms of preventing phishing emails from getting to your people. And so now it's, how do you mitigate the impact of your people getting phishing attacks, right? We know that there's a limit on how effective training can be. Talked about that to death. There's a limit on how effective your filtering is going to be with, while still letting people receive emails. And so now it's on to, like, how do we prevent the bad thing from happening if someone does fall victim to it? And you have to calibrate how much importance and investment you put in based on, like, how the prevalence of the problem. And so what this says to me is, like, this is kind of on the uptick, but it also says, like, if you haven't already gotten on the bus, it's probably too late, because by the time you make any meaningful technical changes, we'll probably see it slosh to something else. Not to say that, like, it's all for naught. Like, it'll be back in terms of, in fact, it'll never go away, right? But this is like one of the most acute problems that are impacting companies, causing them losses that result in an insurance claim. But to me, it says, this is underscoring the importance of things like phishing resistant authentication. And, because, again, to your point, this is probably covering other sorts of, other sorts of categories, like fraud, where it's being delivered via phishing email, but it results in, disclosing payment card information or sensitive data or what have you. And from that perspective, like, that's a business process problem. Like, how do you prevent someone from falling, from disclosing too much, and you can do that by limiting access, make sure they don't have access, or rate limiting. That's the word I was looking for. Rate limiting how fast they can pull information, and so on. So there's lots of different ways that are kind of contextual to what your environment, the risks in your environment. But I think, as we'll talk about in just a minute, like, there are some things that we should be looking at, kind of broadly implementing based on, the changes and trends.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll mention on this bit before we get further into the article is phishing has also migrated away from email. We're seeing a lot of stuff coming over things like Microsoft Teams,
Great point.
Slack, other mechanisms too that maybe we don't have as mature, robust controls or training or awareness around. So it's phishing, again. It's one term that could encompass a whole lot of different techniques.
So it's a great point. It's a great point. You don't necessarily have control over all the different venues that those attacks can come through, or at least the same level of control. So one of the first technologies that this there's a couple of organizations they interview here, that the first one that's recommended is role-based access controls. I thought that was an interesting one in the context of all the things that could be recommended. That was the one that they highlighted as being super important. And I think what they're really pointing to is that a lot of attacks result from people having too much privilege. Their accounts are unnecessarily highly privileged. They have access to things that they don't need. And therefore, if you implement some sort of privileged access control system, it would allow you to more easily get fine-grained on what people can have access to. And therefore, you limit the ability or limit the damage that a person can do if they do fall victim to some sort of an attack.
Yeah, agreed. And I'm glad that you're finally accepting that, as a white male, you have privilege and that it needs to be limited.
That's true. If only there was a way.
But this does go to the same sort of assuming your end user or their machine or their account gets somehow compromised, limit its capabilities by default, limit its trust radius by default. And a lot of organizations struggle with this because it's a lot of work to do role-based authentication properly, and it's a lot of administrative headache and overhead. But it absolutely contains a blast radius when that initial intrusion happens or click happens or whatever it is, because we know it's going to happen. This is one of those. I agree with this. It's a key control that it limits how far a bad actor can get if they do get that initial foothold on some end user account.
Yeah. The reason I say that it was surprising to me is that it is among the more difficult controls to implement, right?
Yeah, but these are the insurers. They don't have to actually. That's an implementation problem, man. That's not their problem.
That's that fair point. It's a very fair point.
That's like, we were just talking about the joys of consulting. You just show up, tell them what you need to do, and leave. Not my problem.
Details. All right. So their next recommendation is to do away with legacy technology. They point out that their incident response repeatedly shows organizations running operating systems as far back as 2008 are relying on niche software that can't be updated, which makes them easy targets. And again, context is like this is a set of organizations who are talking about things that would reduce the rate of claims that result from breaches. So that's where they're coming from here is, that these are insurance companies. They don't want to pay, like they want to collect your premiums, but they don't want to pay out. So they're saying like, these are the things that will help you not pay out. And I think more broadly, even if you don't have cyber insurance, it's a good indication of maybe where you should be putting your money. And, by the way, like this one resonates with me, right? Because we've talked a lot about how especially on some kind of core infrastructure technology like firewalls, that a lot of, especially smaller companies, end up not being current. Fully understand the logic why. I'm not going to pretend that I do, but it's not uncommon for your base network infrastructure. I think there's a lot, like a broad acceptance generally that you have to keep your the version of Windows or Mac OS or whatever on your desktops up to date. But I think there's like pragmatic reasons for that, because the business applications that you're running will eventually stop working. Whereas the thing that's sitting in your closet filtering your traffic, it's just there. You don't see a particular reason to keep it up to date. And so there you have it.
Yeah, as well. Do away with legacy staff, right? If they're old and cranky, not hip on the new AI stuff, get them out.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a really good point.
The other thing is easier said than done, once again, right? If this were easy, this wouldn't be on the list, but no surprise here. No argument.
Meaningful MFA mechanisms is next. Not surprising there. they do point out that phishing losses account for nearly half of all cyber insurance payouts in the first half of 2025. And that compares, by the way, to only 18% in the first half of 2024. So it's gone up quite a bit.
That stat to me is weird. Like from 18 to 49. I'd love to dig into the numbers and see why it doesn't pass the smell test very easily to me. Like, I don't know. Maybe it's one company, it's one set of data, it's their payouts. But boy, I don't feel like the attacks have moved that dramatically different between 2024 and 2025. Whatever. It's a weird stat. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It doesn't change the reality that phishing is a huge problem, but to be only 18% in 2024 doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I don't. Obviously, there isn't any data behind why they're saying that, but I could envision that this is the result of changing tactics on how ransomware is delivered, for example.
Sure.
So I don't know for sure. But the net point is they're saying that this is among the problems, and if you were to implement more robust multi-factor authentication, they specifically call out passkeys and FIDO, you'll reduce your risk by quite a lot.
And physical keys, like a YubiKey or similar type device, which I think especially for privileged accounts and privileged admins makes a lot of sense.
Yes, 100%. And then zero trust networking is a must.
It's your favorite.
It's my favorite. Now, what I find really interesting here is, the justification is, I'll just read it verbatim. Companies also need to modernize their network infrastructure and move away from traditional firewalls and virtual private networks because vulnerabilities in those appliances are often the source of compromise.
That quote drove me crazy, for the record. I have a new eye twitch after that.
But then you get down to the next part. Coalitions, which is the name of the cyber insurance company, claims data show that businesses with exposed VPN login panels are 3 to 4 times more likely to experience a cyber incident, which does not surprise me, by the way.
But what does that have anything to do with zero trust? It's the opposite of that point.
This is where I think we run into a terminology problem, right? Because I'm struggling with it almost it reminds me a lot of the early days of cloud, right? Where everything was cloud. To some extent it's even true today. Like, who are the major cloud providers? Is AWS and Azure and Salesforce, right? You're not talking about necessarily the same things, right? There's kind of a conceptual equivalent there, but it's just not. Anyway, I struggle too. But to me, what they're describing is the very problem I see with zero trust, because too many companies, too many organizations, when they talk about how they're implementing zero trust, it's like, no, like, we have implemented zero trust. You can get to that VPN login panel from the internet because we are authenticating the device and the user who was connecting to it, kind of missing the whole point that, like, when that login panel inevitably has a pre-auth RCE vulnerability in it, all of that authentication crap goes out the window.
Right. So to me, maybe this was the reporter, maybe this is the way this was written up, but this is zero trust. I don't necessarily disagree with, but it's what they're talking about here is not that. They're talking about, hey, this class of device has a lot of vulnerabilities lately, so move away from it. Okay, to what? Or is that more of a design and vulnerability management problem, a patch management problem, whether it is a, just throwing all traditional firewalls, VPNs must be discarded in favor of magic, right? Because they don't necessarily say, at least not in this article. And exposed
Well,
VPN
they
login
make
panels are,
reference to the SAESE, right? They're making
yeah,
reference
okay.
to that, which again I think is like what they're saying to me. What they're saying is VPNs, traditional VPNs and firewalls are so awful that you shouldn't use them at all. Like you should get rid of them and move to an SASE model, which I
I
think
see.
is like I'm trying to come up with an appropriate metaphor, and words are struggling. I'm struggling with my words right now, but like this seems like a catastrophically bad opportunity for people to take something that was bad and make it like 1,000 times worse.
So to be fair, I agree with the concept of like SASE and tying your SaaS providers to a certain VPN tunnel. Like there's value in there. There are layers that make it more difficult for an attacker to steal a token and reuse it directly against a cloud provider. If you're going through like a SASE model or a VPN SaaS model that limits that login to that VPN, I see some value there, which is kind of what I think they're hinting at here. But they're conflating in my mind a couple of different things here. And zero trust to me is less about what type of infrastructure you have than going back to the role-based administration model, which is that you're not automatically granting trust due to a single point of login. Is the way I think of zero trust, that multiple points along the path, each point along the path is in its own way authenticated in some way or proven to be valid in some way. So I don't know, maybe just the way this article is written, I know we're getting bogged down in minutia here, but it feels like they're conflating a bunch of different problems. And the fact that the VPN login panels are getting attacked, I don't think that should be a surprise. That's like, why are banks getting robbed? That's where the logins are. I think it's more a matter of how are you running those, how are you patching those, and how are you monitoring for those. And to your point, if there's an RCE on those, what do you do? So I don't know. It's a lot of weird stuff lumped under zero trust networking here in my mind.
Yeah, I think we have to go back to, you were starting to hit on this. Like I think we have to go back to what are the intentions behind zero trust and hit it that way, which to me it's not trusting the origin. You're not bestowing some privilege, authentication, or trust based on the location of where something is coming from. And so typically that means that you're authenticating both the person and the device using some actual form of authentication. But that does, by the way, that does not mean that you should be allowing the entire goddamn internet to be banging on your application, right? And I fear, and this experience has borne this out, like that's how it's being interpreted, right?
Yeah,
It's
I agree.
by too many people. And I'm not saying everybody does it. I'm sure lots of people are doing this just awesome. But I really think that people read this and they're interpreting it by, saying like, hey, using a VPN is bad. Like the VPN adds another point of compromise. And technically it's true, but think about what it is also providing a protection for. And so I'm kind of with you. I'm thinking, if not that, then what?
Yeah.
So in sassy, I'm sure there's lots of options, but I also fear, again, it's an emerging technology, and I am not confident that it's being implemented in a responsible manner in most places. So that's the world according to Jerry.
Indeed. Wow, we spent a lot of time on this article.
Yeah. So MDR was next, which was I thought interesting. again, I think MDR is one of those things that has really supplanted a lot of traditional security controls at many companies. Like they have just kind of wholesale pivoted to like, CrowdStrike is my security thing or Sentinel-1 is my security thing. Like that's how I know if I have an incident. It's how I know that I'm secure. It's how I know if I have a vulnerability. It's how I know everything.
Yep.
And so I'm
It's
not
an easy button.
surprised. It's absolutely an easy button.
Yeah.
I
It's a
would just say
really
like,
good way for leaders to go, yeah, look, that's their problem now. I bought a solution. I shifted the liability. Did you though? Did you though? And there's also a lot of different quality out there in MDR. And what I
yes,
fear, because you and I have dealt with this a lot, because we both work for managed security service providers, which are kind of like an MDR in some ways, it all becomes a margin game. And it all becomes a how much, you're at a fixed cost usually per month that you're paying to that MDR. Cool. What's the least amount of money they can spend to provide those services? And, it's it can become a race to the bottom with MDR providers. And I've seen a lot of bad MDR providers. You end up managing a lot more than you think you're going to, and they're not nearly as aware contextually or tribal knowledge of your environment. It's not a magic silver bullet, and I'm not arguing against it. There's certainly value if you don't want to staff 24/7 and you need somebody watching consoles. But and what I see right now is a lot of these MDR tools are pivoting towards as much AI as they can to reduce their staff headcount or scale with the same staff. And we're in an experimental phase right now. I'll put it that way. So I don't know. I've gotten burned a few times by MDRs. I'm cautious.
yeah. I think one truism is that they often lack a lot of business context. So, in addition to everything you said, there's kind of this push pull because they want to, on the one hand, cut costs as much as possible, but on the other hand, make sure that they're there and that they're adding value. And so, like, it's not uncommon for service providers like this to have a quota on how many tickets they have to open, which makes sense to some extent, except that it starts again in the context of a provider like this who might not know your environment. It can cause noise. And when you have noise, it causes a lack of attention and focus. And so that's something to be aware of. I don't think the concept is bad. I'm not saying that at all, because a lot of them are very good and will allow you to be aware of things that you would have in any other way. You would have no idea. You would have no idea that something bad is happening. And these providers have created a capability that was just out of reach of most organizations. But just be careful. Make sure that you're not becoming desensitized to if your provider is opening up tickets that are not valuable. Hit that problem. Don't start ignoring them.
Yep.
And then immutable backups is next, which I think are hopefully fairly obvious. My only caveat there is make sure that you know what that means, because I've seen too many times when a organization has created some kind of setup that they thought was an immutable backup. It existed on just a regular server, and some hacker brought it or broke in and actually deleted their backup, and the application that they were using presented it as an immutable backup, but like somebody got in and just wiped it off. So make sure that you are actually using something that is truly immutable.
Yeah, that's fair.
And then the last thing resonated with me a bunch, and that is start using what you have. And there's a quote in here which says, "Stop buying more tools and start using what you have. Our claims data consistently shows that companies have the right security solutions. They're just not properly deployed or managed."
Yeah,
And
I could buy
holy
that.
cow, does that resonate with me? I think it's like a common experience among most security people that our companies, and to some extent ourselves, are enamored with these new tools. And so we go off and we buy them, but we don't ever invest. We don't bring the right level of investment to implement them correctly and keep them cared for and fed and whatnot. Because I think there's this view that the new tool is gonna, it's gonna, drive down your overall operational cost. And that might be true, but often is not.
Yeah. The other thing I'll say is it's usually a lot easier for companies to get budget to buy a tool than it is to hire somebody. And if you don't have enough staff to run these properly, it's a false sense of security. And not just deploy it, but manage it, care and feed for it, ensure that it's operating as expected, et cetera, et cetera. Test it, all that kind of fun stuff.
All right, this next story is from Bleeping Computer, and the title here is Trust Wallet Links $8.5 million crypto theft to Shai Hulud NPM attack. Again, this was a worm of sorts that leveraged GitHub accounts and NPM repository accounts with some automation that is wrapped around those tools that allowed this worm to propagate from one person to the accounts that they manage, and then the consumers of those repositories then infected the repos that those people had access to, and so on and so on and so on. And so this was the first that I'm aware of, and because the total population of impacted companies or repositories was huge. Like there's a lot of organizations that were impacted by this, but this is the first one I've heard of that where there's an actual loss. And unsurprisingly, it was a crypto wallet company who produces a browser plugin. And what happened here was that this Trust Wallet produces this browser plugin. One of their developers fell victim to this Shai Hulud, which meant that their the keys to their both GitHub repository and ultimately their Chrome Web Store account were leaked. The people behind Shai Hulud used that to create a custom version of the browser plugin, which they then posted to the Chrome Web Store, which then caused some number of people. It's not clear to me if it auto updated or if it was just new installs. I'm not clear on that, but it caused some number of end customers of Trust Wallet to have their, the authentication information for their crypto wallets, be captured by this threat actor who then stole money out of their wallet to the tune of $8.5 million. Now, to their credit, to Trust Wallet's credit, they're actually apparently replacing the money that was stolen. So that's good. The thing that is, I guess, a little aggravating to me is that, if you look at the timeline here, they were impacted in November. Their keys were stolen in November. The attack didn't happen for almost a month later. I think it was maybe a little more than a month later. And it was only after that attack that Trust Wallet apparently realized this had happened. It was after that they rotated their keys, that they took action. They pulled down the infected version of their browser plugin, and they did all of the cleanup stuff. But it was surprising to me that a month went by with them not realizing that they were impacted by Shai Hulud. Like, this was not a small story.
Yeah.
I'm stunned, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
There's a lot of interesting things here that kind of got my attention too about a lot of automation and expectation of only certain things should happen for certain reasons. For instance, and I think many companies probably have the same blind spot. Somebody pushes a brand new version of your Chrome extension to the Chrome Web Store. Do you have any monitoring for that to match that back up against you are expecting to push a new version? Probably not. I don't think most people do. So their assumption that would only push, there would only be a new one out there if we did it and we intend to do it. There's no reason to monitor for that and match it back up against our own release schedules. Maybe there should be, right? This also goes back to a little bit of what you were saying earlier about having everything open to the internet. The Chrome Web Store, once that API key or whatever sort of key it was stolen, could be used from anywhere. Again, that's probably something to look at, but there's probably a lot of other indicators of compromise that aren't being monitored for, aren't being seen. I think this is something we've talked about before, where I think security teams in general aren't deep enough into the CI/CD pipeline to help monitor and alert for things like this, and the developers aren't aware of these sorts of problems well enough to self-alert on these things. So I do think security teams need to get a lot deeper, if they're in a dev house, into understanding these attack flows and where to monitor for them, because I don't think it's happening.
We have a lot of objective evidence that says you're right. Absolutely.
CrowdStrike doesn't run on GitHub, so you can't just rely on them, right?
True enough.
So there's a lot of things here that I would love to see a deeper postmortem. The other thing that's interesting is that the effective period was between December 24th and December 26th. So that tool, that version might have been out there for a while, but it was clear that the bad actors waited until right around Christmas, when many people are off, to trigger the attack, which smart on their part.
Yeah, absolutely.
Last thing that I saw was interesting too was obviously the Chrome Web Store wants to make this easy, right? They want to reduce barriers, but they passed the review. What good is that review? Like, this was an unauthorized third party that pushed that, obviously with the right credentials. I think there's a lot of trust there that's very easily abused.
I'm guessing that probably everybody involved thinks that some sort of security related check is happening that actually isn't. So I don't know what they're actually doing, but obviously it wasn't, whatever inspection they're doing wasn't sufficient to catch this. Now, I don't know if they implemented some sort of, anti-analysis. Don't have any indication one way or the other based on this article. But yeah, that's, I guess if you have a dev shop, and I thought this was just table stakes, I guess you're responsible for the security of a team of developers, and something like Shai Hulud happens. I just don't understand the logic behind not investigating whether you were hit, or, whether you were part of that. And it's not like this was something that was hidden. The way this particular attack transpired was pretty obvious if you were a victim, and based on the additional files and in some cases the additional repositories that it created using kind of deterministic names, I just have a hard time understanding how a company with that kind of responsibility wouldn't. Now, maybe they did and it just didn't look like it. I don't know. I think it's very important for a security team to maintain situational awareness about the stuff that could be impacting your organization. And when something happens, that, to me, it was always the proactive was as important as the reactive. Like, obviously, if we became aware that, one of our security tools was showing that we had a compromise ongoing, that was obviously a big deal. But like, anytime something happened out in the world, that looked like it strayed into our space, we would go and try to figure out, like, did it have any relevance to us? And I think it's very important, especially if you're responsible for, like, security of a bunch of money. That just seems very, very basic to me.
One thing I've seen as well is that dev teams and security teams don't always get along well. And
That's
there
a
could be
great point.
some walls up between those organizations.
Great point.
And I mean, not I'm not trying to cast aspersion, but often a lot of developers just want to do what they want to do, and they don't want to follow a particular methodology that enables security to do their thing. They want to use whatever tool they want, whatever environment they want, whatever code they want, whatever, so they want the freedom and the flexibility, which is sometimes at odds with security and monitoring. That could be a challenge.
Right. So moving on, Wired gets zapped. So this is a story from securityweek.com, and the title here is Hackers Claim Theft of 40 Million Condé Nast Records After Wired Data Leak. By the way, there's a whole interesting side story. If you go and read there's an article on databreaches.net where the hacker here purported to be a security researcher and actually enlisted the help of the administrator of the databreaches.net website. And, kind of unknowingly, that person kind of unknowingly helped with some aspects of this. So, but that's a sideshow. So anyway, the story here is that there was about 40 million records stolen. Condé Nast, apparently, as I've come to learn, is responsible for the security of all the data, including that which was stolen from Wired. There was, I think they're saying 2.3 million of the 40 million were associated with Wired. The actual attack appears like it was a insecure direct object reference. So, like, somebody, they didn't download it. They didn't log in and download a database. What they did was just iterate through a form on a web page and scrape the data off of each page, or they had an API that they were able to do something very similar to. So this is a very basic kind of vulnerability. I think it's definitely one of the OWASP top 10 issues, but this is so old. Like, this was the thing that got Kevin Mitnick into trouble with AT&T on, like, was it 30 years ago?
God rest his soul.
Yeah. So anyway, this is I am disappointed that a company that large would have such a
I mean, after this long, does it still disappoint you? Does it even surprise you?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I'm not mad. I am disappointed.
You're too old to get mad. You're too tired to get mad.
That's right. That is correct. Anyway, by the way, I think the other notable aspect of this story is that apparently Wired and Condé Nast are just kind of not talking about it. Like, they've made no public statements about the issue. I don't know if they're going to make a disclosure or not. This is I would say a not well handled incident.
They're not that familiar with publications and putting out statements and writing articles. That's not their. Oh wait, it is. I mean, more than anything, I'm sure their lawyers are the ones controlling that anyway. So I would wager there's plenty of people who would like to talk about it who are being told no, you can't, you're not allowed. Lawyer said don't. Blame the lawyers, my friend.
I'm sure you're right. All right. So the next story we have is about software liability, and
this is the one, by the way, that you said this one was super interesting. I think that is perhaps in the eye of the beholder.
Fair enough. The title here is software company lacked downstream liability for data breach. This is a 8-year-old now. It's a case related to a now 8-year-old data breach where a company who bought a service from another company that was supplied by Barracuda with some kind of mail archiving service. And the Barracuda service had a data breach which impacted the end customer, and the end customer ended up having to make a disclosure and then was the recipient of a class action lawsuit for all of its customers who were impacted by that data breach. And so this has been banging around in the legal system for quite some time. Ultimately, the cyber insurer paid out. They paid out the claim from those class action suits, and then the insurer tried to go back and collect money from Barracuda, claiming that Barracuda needed to indemnify the the reseller and the customer of the reseller. Now, what ended up happening is that the court said, point number one is there's no direct business relationship between the end customer and Barracuda. So the end customer, by the way, was Zoll, company named Zoll Services, and they bought that from another company, which was a reseller. I don't remember the name of the reseller right now, but they bought it through a reseller who then purchased it from Barracuda. Now, the contract between the reseller and Barracuda said that the reseller, when it resold its services, had to have an indemnity clause, right? So like that they would indemnify Barracuda and whatnot. Anyway, that they didn't do that. Not only did they not do that, by the way, but they also sold this service under a business associates agreement. For anybody who knows what that means, it's it's kind of a bad thing when they didn't also get a BAA, business associates agreement, with Barracuda. So they were putting it out there that HIPAA data, PHI, could be processed by this service offering, but they did not go back and sign an equivalent agreement. We call that back-to-back agreements. They did not have a back-to-back agreement with Barracuda that made sure that it was also protected. What was most interesting in this case, there's a lot of technicalities in the ultimate decision based on what was in the contract and not in the contract. But one of the things that was most fascinating to me was that the insurance company was trying to put the onus on Barracuda for not auditing the reseller, right? The contract between Barracuda and the reseller said that Barracuda had the right to audit the reseller. And so the insurance company was asserting that Barracuda was in part liable because they did not exercise their right to audit, which is just fascinating.
Totally. There's a lot to unpack here. So, again, there's a lot of kind of legal technicalities in here, but I thought the thing that I wanted to talk about and kind of impart on everybody is that the more steps away you have from a provider, the more complex the legal relationship that you have. And so I know that there's a lot of, I kind of go back to the whole, nobody ever got fired for using IBM thing, right? There's a lot of weight behind the providers that you choose to use. And there's I think an unspoken aspect of that is that, if something bad ever happens, you're going to have the ability to get, a pound of flesh out of that company because they're a big company. They're a
reliable company. They are going to stand behind their offering. But that's not necessarily true, because the legal complexities that go into these contracts are vast. The more steps away you have, like if you're buying it through a reseller, it becomes even more so. And I think that this is perhaps an acute problem, because these days a lot of what we buy are software as a service, and we buy those software as a service typically through some sort of a reseller. That might be like CrowdStrike, right? You buy CrowdStrike through a reseller. Well, their infrastructure is hosted on AWS. Well, what happens if AWS has a breach that impacts CrowdStrike? Well, it could hurt you, the end customer. But do you have any kind of legal way to get compensation from AWS if AWS screws up? And
Yeah.
the answer based on this is maybe not.
I am not a lawyer. Don't pretend to be a lawyer. And there's a lot of complexities here I don't understand, to be very honest. It is interesting. I think this has a lot to do with, when I'm doing purchasing and such, my legal team gets involved, and it usually is very time consuming. But this is important stuff that they're looking at. I'm assuming that they're watching for and catching this sort of thing. So if I try to echo this back to you, so the customer bought Barracuda email archiving service from a reseller who was selling it on behalf of Barracuda. That customer set up a service for whatever they're doing with it, and Barracuda had a breach, and that customer got sued by the people using the customer's instance of Barracuda.
Right.
And the insurance company paid out and then turned around and went after Barracuda. And Barracuda basically said, no, we have no liability agreement with that end customer, and we are not responsible for this.
And furthermore, not only that, like, the reseller was not in compliance with our agreement.
Right, because the way they wrote their contracts.
Right.
Interesting.
And so it was like a double whammy. And so yeah, that's but I think you hit it exactly. And so I guess for the purposes of Zoll, who was the end customer, they were made whole, right? The cyber insurer paid out, right? They were whole. It was the insurance company that was left holding the bag. But that was, I assume you're going to see insurance companies kind of close that hole after this decision. But I think the point is that you need to really make sure that your contracts are sound. Like this is important stuff. Like you can't delegate responsibility to for the protection of your data to some third party. You are accountable. If something bad happens, you are the.
And the flip side of this is I can see Barracuda's position, which is, hey, we never entered into a business agreement with the end customer here. So how can we be expected to take on liability when we never had the ability to negotiate a deal? Or I don't know. Boy, this one's a complicated one, and I feel like I'm way out over my skis, and I don't fully understand all the ins and outs here. But one thing, probably not. I'm going to say this, and it's going to be stupid, so I'm just saying that right now. But I wonder if this has anything to do with like open source components in a software package that has a vulnerability, and it's boiled into a commercial package, and the commercial package is sold. And we talk about these liability issues floating around and people trying to hold people liable. I wonder if this would have any bearing on that. Of like you could go back after the open source developer because somebody else used their package, and I don't know. It's probably way different, but it feels like a similar sort of concept of who owns the liability when somebody starts reselling and using other bits and pieces of technology. So I don't know. I honestly, I am way out of my area of expertise here.
So it's an interesting question that you raised, and I'm actually surprised that we haven't. I mean, I'm not saying that it hasn't happened, but we have had a lot of high profile cases like between OpenSSL and Bash and React and XZ. There's been a bunch of high profile damaging vulnerabilities in open source that did manifest itself as problems in commercial software. And so I am surprised that we haven't seen some, an attempt to do that. Now, I don't think it'll get very far. And I suspect that probably, I'm going to guess, one of the reasons is that a lawyer isn't going to take, like a trial lawyer, isn't going to take a case that they don't think is going to be financially viable. And so if you are a company that consumes an open source project that has a vulnerability, and that vulnerability is not malicious, not the product of them trying to hack you, they're not going to get a lot of money out of a person, right? Because it's not like a business behind it. They're not going to be able to, for all intents and purposes, like even pay the lawyers. So, like if you're a law firm looking at that, like I'm not going to be super excited to take on a case like that. And that's even aside from like the moral part.
And I'm wondering if there's all sorts of like stuff in like the GPL languages and how the licenses are written to protect them. And it would have a huge chilling impact, I think, on the open source community if suddenly they're starting to be held liable and could be dragged into court for a third party using it in some way. It's ugly. All sorts of ugliness. And again, I'm going to say 100%. This one more time. I don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to legal stuff here, so I should just be quiet.
Anyway, I thought it was, the takeaways for me were, broadly speaking, make sure that you have somebody competent looking at your agreements. We're security people. These things are complicated. Don't assume that because the service that you're being provided is backed by some big brand name reputable company, that it is being delivered to you in a way that is secure. Like, if, for example, if you have a business associates agreement, you need to make sure that the company that you're contracting with has in turn a BAA with the providers that make up the service that they're offering to you. That is something that, you are ultimately responsible for in ensuring. I think in this instance, it worked out okay for Zoll. Like they had brain damage and whatnot, but like financially, it sounds like their insurance company made them whole, which is good for them. But I'm sure they had a lot of unpleasantness and would probably have preferred this not to have happened at all. Just
by the way, we're not lawyers, and this is not legal advice. Talk to your lawyer.
Yeah, my only legal advice is to talk to someone who can give you actual legal advice. All right, so moving on to our last story. This is about Home Depot. So this comes from TechCrunch, and the title here is Home Depot exposes access to internal systems for a year. Oopsie. You've seen this before. This happens, with somewhat regularity, not necessarily with Home Depot. It's unclear to me exactly how this came to be. It's not covered in the article, but anyway, there's a security researcher who identified a key that provided access to GitHub code repositories that were owned by Home Depot, and so I'm assuming that because he found them, it was public and it was available for anybody to find. And it looks like that was exposed for about a year, sometime in early 2024, they're saying. But where it goes off the rails is like the response. Apparently Home Depot just has been kind of very non-responsive. This person tried sending emails, contacting the CISO of Home Depot over LinkedIn, and ultimately in frustration and engaged a reporter at TechCrunch who then reached out to Home Depot. And it was only after that that the key was invalidated. By the way, they have not responded to follow-up questions. They basically said, thank you for telling us. And they haven't responded back to any questions. Like, do they have logs to see if anybody had actually accessed the data and code that were on in those repositories? They're just kind of incommunicado. So it's kind of an example of how not to do things. Now, it's unclear like what data was in there. So they may not have any kind of a reporting responsibility if they've determined that this isn't like a material breach and there's no personal information. They may not have an obligation to report it to anybody. And so maybe that's the decision that they've come to. But yeah, this is the kind of thing that I think will really kind of create a wedge between your organization and the security community. And anyway, I don't recommend this. I find from personal experience, if you are cooperative and accommodating to security people and responsive, like, it goes a lot better for you. You don't have people on a podcast talking about how irresponsible you were in responding to this kind of incident.
And look, when you have a published bug bounty or responsible disclosure program or something, you're gonna get spam. You're gonna get bottom feeders looking for stupid payouts on dumb. But stuff like this is what you're also gonna get. And mistakes happen. And we've talked a lot about this sort of thing, like GitHub keys get published by accident all the time. And this researcher, at least based on the article we're seeing, was trying to do the right thing, was trying to warn them. And they were ignoring him and not providing him a way to warn the company, which, yeah, that feels irresponsible to me. And I don't understand. Home Depot didn't reply to any comments, any requests for comments. So we have no idea what their side of this is. But I think it's pretty table stakes to at least have a page that says, hey, if you've got a vulnerability you want to report, to it this way. You can put scope around it. You don't have to pay them. You can, but you should at least be open to getting the report in some way, shape, or form. And I have trouble understanding why Home Depot wouldn't do that. That's pretty table stakes to me. It's pretty basic stuff.
Yeah, it's unclear. I mean, maybe they thought it was a scam. I don't know. That's the only thing I could come up with, is that Home Depot thought the attempted report was itself some sort of a scam. In the article, the researcher says that he actually used the key to see what it had access to confirm that it was still valid and that what it had access to. And there wasn't an apparent recognition that somebody not authorized was actually using the keys. That is concerning.
Yeah. I'm also curious what other data was truly exposed, and how many, and they even mentioned in the article, did anybody else access this data? I mean, Home Depot may know, they may not know. I don't know.
The researcher said the keys allowed access to Home Depot's cloud infrastructure, including order fulfillment, inventory management systems, and code development pipelines, among other systems. That sounds really bad on its face.
Yeah, that's a lot of different stuff with one key. So I don't know, but I go back to at least be open to the report. I get that may be annoying, and I get, especially like they said, hey, reached out to the CISO on LinkedIn. Look, I get slammed on LinkedIn all day long with crap. I understand that. But if you're not giving some sort of avenue to have somebody in your SOC or whatever take a look at these reports, you're just asking for trouble. And they found it.
Yeah. I have had I've had similar problems reporting bugs to other companies where they just don't acknowledge it. So I guess on the one hand I'm not surprised, but on the other hand, it feels like this company would have the size and scale of a security team that would at least have an official communications channel, and that doesn't appear to exist. So
hell, you can even outsource those. Like,
yeah,
I know HackerOne, for instance, you can have your VDP emails go to them and they'll vet them for you. They'll do the due diligence. You don't have to do it yourself. You just got to pay somebody else to do it. So this is a solved problem in my mind. This is not difficult.
Yeah.
Again, we don't have Home Depot side of it.
It has the appearance of sloppiness. There you go. All right. That is the story or the show for today. And that was the story for that one. Thank you very much. If you want to find links to the stores we talked about, go to our website at defensivesecurity.org. Look for episode 300. And you'll find all of the links. Reminder that we are on YouTube. Just search for Defensive Podcasts. And thank you very much for everybody who follows us there and is helping us to achieve our dream of becoming YouTube billionaires. So we're a long way off. We're not even like YouTube 100 airs yet, but you gotta time.
That's right. We'll get there.
And thank you again to our Patreon sponsors. Just a quick reminder, if you do want to catch up with us offline, our contact info is on the screen. Well, go ahead and give yours, and then I'll give mine.
Yeah, no, I'm on both X and InfoSec.exchange, which is your phenomenal Mastodon server. At Lerg, L-E-R-G, on both platforms.
Awesome. And I am at Jerry at InfoSec.exchange. And, I will just put a plug in. InfoSec.exchange is a pretty cool place, has a lot of security people that moved over from Twitter, and some people are actually now moving back from Blue Sky too. So it's a pretty happening place, and hope to see you there. So with that, we will talk again next week. I hope you had a great new year, and I hope 2026 treats you well.
Indeed. Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Take care.